Alrighty, so it is week 7 of the NFL season already. This is coming after back-to-back Monday Night Football games, which I don't absolutely love. I don't know how you guys feel about them. You guys must love it as well, because if not, then the NFL wouldn't have, back-to-back Monday night games. Has nothing to do with TV deals or TV ratings. Not my favorite though, but it is what it is. We are here in week 7 for my waiver wire video, be covering the QB, tight end, wide receiver, and running back positions that I think you need to pick up this week before the waiver wire clears, whenever it clears in your league. So the first QB I want to talk about is Jackson Dart, New York Giants. It has been 2 consecutive weeks where he has looked good. He's running the football, passing the football. It's even crazier to think about how good he has looked, especially this last week, because he really doesn't have anybody out there to throw the football to. This offensive unit for the Giants is slowly getting more and more cohesive. You're seeing Cam Scatterboot come on. You're seeing Jackson Dart come on more. Like, the whole thing's starting to just click. So it is one of those things where if you are in 12-man leagues or if you are in Superflex leagues, I do think that Jackson Dart is somebody that is worth picking up, stashing on your bench, continuing to see how he looks week over week over week. I think that there's going to be a continued elevation in his play and just like how cohesive this offense is. If he's available in your 12-man league, Superflex leagues, which he might not be, but had you watched the video last week, you would pick him up last week. But if you didn't, and he is available now, pick him up now, stash him on your bench, monitor it going forward. Hopefully, like I already said, we see an increase in production, and he ends up being somebody that's viable for you to start and plug and play on a weekly basis. The second and final QB that I want to touch on today is Sam Darnold. I said it for the last couple of weeks that he has looked better. This offense for the Seahawks right now is slowly creeping towards being a top 10 offensive unit. They are passing the football down the field pretty effectively. JSN is kind of unstoppable right now. It's kind of gross. I don't know how defense haven't just like locked him up and locked him down. And the defense is fantastic. The defense is going to cause turnovers. Defense is going to get you back on the field pretty quickly. They're putting offenses in bad spots. They're getting them to go 3 and out or committing short drives on a consistent basis. This is going to set it up where you're going to have more and more time for Sam Darnold to be out there on the field. So if they are behind, that is going to set it up where he's going to have opportunities to score again in the second half and the fourth quarter. In 8-man and 10-man leagues, he may not be quite as viable. It's one of those things where it's a lot more matchup dependent. If it's a higher scoring game, or if the game script calls for him to pass the football a lot more because they're not able to run, then he ends up being more of like a higher end QB1, somebody you'd want to start that week. So it really comes down to how your league is rostering QBs and utilizing QBs and like how deep your league actually is. 12-man leagues, Superflex leagues, I'd pick him up, put him on my bench, play him when I want to play him. And in 8-man and 10-man leagues, like I kind of already said, you can plug and play him certain weeks depending on the matchup, depending on the game script. Alrighty, so at the tight end position, flipping over to tight end, the first tight end I want to talk about is Harold Fannin. I feel like I talked about him in week 2, and everybody else talked about him in week 2. At this point in time, it's not my favorite tight end like waiver wire pickup, only because of how bad this Browns offense is going to be. They're not going to be a top 10 scoring offense. They'll be lucky to be a league average scoring offense by the end of the season. At this point in time, it's not my favorite situation with Dillon Gabriel out there, but he needs somebody to be like the easy check down blanket, and that could end up being Harold Fannin for him in this offensive unit. So in 10-man leagues, 12-man leagues, I think he is viable to pick up, stash on your bench, and see how it looks going forward. If he's going to be that guy for Dillon Gabriel, I think he's going to be viable later on in the season. It is a weird hedgy bet, because of the fact that you're hoping Shedeur comes to play and that he actually elevates this offense. You're hoping that eventually the Browns offense looks better with Shedeur Sanders playing, or maybe Dillon Gabriel. But at this point in time, the reason why it's so like and cringy is because of how bad this offense has looked. Harold Fannin still has the decent amount of juice. He still is an explosive player. He still is going to be someone who's going to be involved, but he's involved with a bottom 10 scoring offense. So it's like, give and take. It really depends on your league size and like how people are rostering tight ends. So the next 2 tight ends I'm going to touch on real fast because I've talked about them so many times and I've stopped talking about one of them. The first one is Zach Ertz for the Washington Commanders. We saw it again last night in Monday Night Football that Zach Ertz is still going to be a viable tight end in 12-man leagues, especially going forward. I mentioned it in waiver wire videos at the beginning of the season that his roster percentage needed to creep up, especially in 10-man, but specifically 12-man leagues. If you're in a 12-man league and he's available in your league, he is worth picking up if you do not have a better, like, reliable, viable option at the tight end position. He's somebody who's going to be the easy check down target for Jaden Daniels on a weekly basis. He's somebody on this Commanders team who's going to get red zone and end zone targets on a weekly basis because Jaden knows where he's going to be, knows that he can catch the football, knows that he can rely on him to score touchdowns for this football team. So it really comes down to like your league size and like how much you need help at the tight end position, but I think Zach Ertz is worth rostering. So the next tight end that I've talked about way too much, so I'll try and keep it really short, is Isaiah Likely for the Baltimore Ravens. I know that he didn't look that great in his return in week 5 and didn't really pop off in week 6, but you still don't have Lamar Jackson out there. Cooper Rush really hasn't looked that great through his first couple of starts for the Baltimore Ravens. I do believe when Lamar Jackson comes back after this bye week in week 7, in week 8, we're going to see an elevated play out of this offensive unit for the Baltimore Ravens. Isaiah Likely is going to get more and more involved like they had planned for him last season and coming into 2025 before his injury. He is somebody at the tight end position because he's attached to Lamar Jackson. He's attached to a top 10 scoring offense, or what could be a top 10 scoring offense for the Baltimore Ravens in the back half of the season. He has some viability as like a middling to a bottom of the barrel tight end 1 in the back half of the year. I do think Isaiah Likely is an easy person to pick up, stash on your bench, especially in like 10-man, 12-man leagues where the waiver wire is pretty picked clean. If you don't have a better tight end option, I think he's worth stashing and kind of seeing if we can get some of that emergence of talent like we saw flashes of in 2024 in 2025. All right, so transitioning now over to the wide receiver position. The first wide receiver I have for you is Kayshon Boutte. I feel like we've been here before. It was what, week 2, week 3? Talked about Kayshon Boutte. We are back on it. Obviously, Stephon Diggs in week 4 and week 5 emerged as the number 1 target earner for this Patriots team. It does look like there's going to be a little bit of competition for the second wide receiver, whether it's Boutte, whether it's Pop Douglas. I don't really believe he's viable in 8-man leagues. He's probably not viable unless like you have like a super deep league for a 10-man league, but for 12-man leagues, I think he's worth stashing, throwing on your bench, seeing if he ends up like truly emerging as the wide receiver 2 option for Drake May. And at this point in time, I just want somebody who's attached to this Patriots offense, to Drake May, and who has the potential to be the number 2 target earner for this like pretty good offense the first 6 weeks, and hopefully it continues to improve in the back half of the season. The next wide receiver that I've been talking about pretty much every single week, and I'll keep talking about him a little bit louder now. I don't love the offense for the Titans, but the wide receiver is Alec Manor. It does look like after Calvin Ridley's injury in week 6 that he may not play for the next handful of weeks. He is kind of an older wide receiver, even though he hasn't been in the league for that long, so he could end up being sidelined for a couple of weeks, for a handful of weeks. Really just don't know at this point in time. It is something to monitor. I don't love how the Titans offense has looked. I don't love how Cam Ward has honestly looked. They did recently fire Brian Callahan though, so I'm hoping that maybe this transition will help things out for this Tennessee Titans team as a whole, especially this offensive unit that's kind of been struggling through the first 6 weeks. I'm hopeful again, Alec Manor with Calvin Ridley out will emerge as like a high volume target earner. Maybe he's not the best option for you. 10-man leagues, 12-man leagues, I think he's worth picking up if he's still available in your league, which he probably is not. But if he's available, pick him up, stash him on your bench, see how he looks in week 7 with Calvin Ridley potentially being out, and see if he can emerge like as the true number 1 target earner for not the favorite offense in the NFL. But if you're in deeper leagues, he's viable as somebody who could like plug and play, especially in bye weeks. And maybe he'll emerge after the bye week in the back half of the season, like a lot of rookie wide receivers do in the NFL. So the next wide receiver group, I'm going to say it's a group, is pretty much all the Tampa Bay Buccaneer wide receivers. So the question is kind of like, who's going to be the best wide receiver option for the Tampa Bay Bucs in week 7? If all those people are out, I really don't know. It could be Sterling Shepard. It could be Tez Johnson. It could be a handful or a litany of guys. It could be Cade Otton. Who knows? At this point in time, it's kind of like the big question mark, but if you're in 10-man, 12-man leagues, it's probably worth taking your shot on Sterling Shepard or one of these other wide receivers on this football team. Baker's going to have to throw the football to somebody. They're going to have to score points, especially going up against the Lions this week on Monday Night Football. Not obviously this last Monday, but this coming Monday, they're playing the Lions. Should be a higher scoring game. They're going to have to move the ball down the field in bunches, so he's going to have to find somebody to throw the football to on a consistent basis. Again, I don't really know who it's going to be. Kind of like I said last week with the Chargers backfield. Wasn't sure if it was going to be Haskins or Vidal. Ended up being Vidal. Same thing with the Buccaneers in week 7. Not sure who the best option is. Sterling Shepard is the veteran on the team, so he'll probably get a decent chunk of those targets. Are they going to be down the field, higher quality targets? I don't know. But what I do know is one of these guys, 2 of these guys are going to have to be the primary ball catchers in week 7. So deeper leagues worth picking up and probably starting in a potentially higher scoring game against the Lions on Monday Night Football. So the next wide receiver, not going to talk about for very long either. If you didn't hear all the other videos before, I've been saying it since week 2. So this isn't news for me. It is Jordan Whittington for the Rams. I don't think Puka Nacua is going to miss this week, but if he ends up missing, I do believe that Whittington is a viable option, especially in 10-man and 12-man leagues. I said it earlier in the season, explosive wide receiver. If Puka went down, if Devontae went down, especially if they miss considerable chunks of time, I think he is worth stashing, regardless of if you can actually play him this week. If Puka does play, don't worry about it. Keep him on your bench. Another deep league stash option is Torrey Horton for the Seahawks. I've talked about him every single week. He had another opportunity for a long touchdown this week that Sam Darnold underthrew again. Feels like every week he has like a deep bomb that is slightly underthrown. At some point in time, him and Sam Darnold are going to be on like the exact same page. Those targets are going to start hitting, and he's going to be like a boom bust guy. guy. So at this point in time, he's not somebody you're able to start, but if there ends up being an injury to JSN or more than likely Cooper Kupp, I believe he ends up being like a wide receiver 3 or a high-end wide receiver 4. So somebody who's worth picking up, stashing in your bench, and seeing how it looks and seeing if he can get more involved just naturally. Or if there ends up being an injury, like we're seeing with the Rams this coming week, he's somebody who could be a plug-and-play guy for you, depending on injuries and depending on like the matchups going forward. The next wide receiver is Jalen Coker, coming back off of injury. They need a wide receiver 2 for this Panthers team. Bryce Young has looked a little bit better. The running game obviously looked a lot better with Rico Dowdle out there. We'll see how that looks. It's a whole different thing, obviously. At this point in time, Panthers defense still not that great, so they're still going to get scored on. Means they're going to have to throw the football a lot, especially in the second half. I do think they need a complement to Ted McMillan, so Jalen Coker, I believe, can be that guy. So if you're in 10-man leagues, 12-man leagues, I think he's worth picking up, stashing on your bench, seeing how he looks when he comes back from injury, and seeing if he's like the viable number 2 option for this Panthers team. If he is, depending on the matchup, he may be like a higher end wide receiver 3 in those specific weeks. The rest of the week's probably not going to want to start him, but really kind of depends on what he looks like and how viable he is on this offense for the Panthers. So the next wide receiver that I've talked about like way too much almost every single week, so I'm like done talking about him, is Josh Downs. I've talked about him in pretty much every single video. If you didn't believe me, maybe you believe me now. I told you. Eventually, him and Danny Dimes were going to get on the same page. The routes he's running, he's not more of a possession receiver like Michael Pittman Jr., so he wasn't going to be involved quite as heavily in the beginning of the season. We saw it in week 6. I think the connection between him and Daniel Jones will continue to improve week over week over week, and he'll be somebody who's viable for you as like a wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 option, depending on the matchup and depending on bye weeks for your other players in fantasy football. So last wide receiver I want to touch on, I believe I talked about him in week 3, again in week 5, it is Luther Burden. He looked pretty good on Monday Night Football. The targets are there. I'm thinking that with DJ Moore having whatever injury action ended up happening, hopefully he recovers quickly. But this should set it up where Luther Burden ends up being the wide receiver 2 option on this football team with Roman Dunze as the wide receiver 1. Caleb Williams is looking better. Ben Johnson has his offense clicking. DeAndre Swift was popping off. So like the run game was kind of viable in week 6 against the Commanders. Like I said in those previous 2 videos, I think his involvement on this offense, his target share is going to continue to creep up and up and up. It ends up setting it up where if the Bears can be a top 10 scoring offense, he is somebody you're going to want to have on your team and be a plug and play guy, depending on the match, depending on the game script, depending on the opponent on a weekly basis for this Bears team. So pick him up, 8-man, 10-man, 12-man league, stash him on your bench, see how he looks in week 7, week 8, and he really could be somebody who's viable for your fantasy football team in the back half of the season. At the running back spot, I'm going to run through these pretty quick because this video's been kind of long. The first guy I want to mention, I talked about him for the past couple weeks, is Tyjae Spears. He looked more explosive in week 6. He was getting targets, he was getting touches. He looks good. Tony Pollard, it's not bad, but like Tony Pollard isn't quite as explosive. This Titans team is going to have a new head coach or interim head coach. They haven't looked that great on offense. I do think Tyjae Spears is going to get more and more worked in, especially with how bad the offense has looked. And Tony Pollard's been at the helm for the past, 5 weeks primarily. Now in week 6, we're seeing a little bit of a transition. I think it's going to end up being more of a 50-50 split going forward. Worst case scenario for Tyjae Spears, and best case scenario, he starts to take over this backfield, be more involved in the passing game, and is somebody that's worth stashing right now, because if he ends up taking over as the RB1 for the Titans, even though they're not that high scoring of a team at this point in time, I just feel like he has the potential to be somebody who's like a high-end running back 3 in fantasy football. And at that point in time, he may be not your favorite guy, but 10-man, 12-man leagues, bye weeks, plug and play guy, depending on the matchup, I think he's viable in fantasy football, especially in the back half of the season. 2 more guys I've talked about in previous weeks. Kamani Vidal, at this point in time, looks like he's the guy that you want, not Hassan Haskins. Said it last week, it was a gut call depending on who you wanted to pick up in fantasy football for week 6. If he's available in your league, go pick him up. Don't know how long he's going to be viable. I don't think he's worth burning like a lot of fab on or like a super high waiver priority spot, to be 100% honest. He played the Dolphins. We saw how bad the Dolphins like rush defense is like to every single running back. At this point in time, I want to say they're bottom 3. It might be the worst actually in running back yards allowed per game through the past 3 weeks. So I don't really know how much that was Kamani Vidal or just how bad the Dolphins like rush defense actually is. But if you are desperate for running back help, he's somebody who's going to be viable for at least the next handful of weeks because of the fact that we have Omarion Hampton on IR. So if you need running back help, he's attached to a decent enough offense for the Chargers. You know they're going to run the football. So Kamani Vidal is viable enough in fantasy football for the next handful of weeks. The other guy that I've talked about way too much, Kendra Miller, looked good enough in week 6. Probably never going to be like this high-end running back guy in fantasy football, But if Kamara ends up going down with injury, or Kamara gets a little more phased out, or maybe even Kamara ends up getting traded, which probably isn't very likely, but if it ends up happening, Kendra Miller becomes like a high-end RB3 in fantasy football. Nothing like too crazy or too gaudy, but it is handcuff season still. So like him, Blake Corum, Tyler Algier, all of these guys are viable to pick up and stash on your bench at this point in time. We're not gonna like talk about all of them because like you already know, like they're just handcuffs. Like they're worth picking up depending on if there's an injury. There could be a plug and play guy for your fantasy football team in the back half of the season. Alrighty, so there's my week 7 waiver wire pickups at the QB, tight end, wide receiver, and running back spots. Hopefully this video helps you get just a little bit closer to winning your fantasy football championship in 2025. If you guys are playing in DST leagues, I will have that video somewhere around here, below, above, wherever, once that video is actually posted later on today. If you guys feel so inclined, go check that video out as well. Hopefully I'll see you guys again. No, hopefully you guys will see me again real soon. And until then, y'all have a blessed day. Bye.